I'll never forget that night. I still hear the creaking of the floorboards in my nightmares, the cold, eerie wind that seeped through the cracks in the walls, and the faint sounds that didn't belong to the farm. My name is Nick Hansen, and this is the story of what happened to me on that forsaken farm. It started out like any other trip to check on the land. I wasn't new to the farm life. I'd spent most of my childhood on my uncle's property in North Dakota. But this particular trip, it was meant to be a quick weekend visit. My cousin Eric had been having trouble with the barn, and he needed help with some maintenance. It didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary. We'd always spent long hours working, but the old farmhouse was where we'd rest at night, and over the years, it had become a place of comfort. The kitchen was filled with the scent of fresh coffee. The creaky wooden floors were familiar beneath our feet, and the rustling of the wind outside was a constant, comforting hum. But this time, something was different. From the very moment I set foot on the property, I felt a strange unease, an unsettling presence that I couldn't explain. It was already late when I arrived, just after dusk, and I knew that I wouldn't be able to help much with the repairs in the dark. Eric greeted me at the gate, his face pale, his eyes wide. He didn't look like the cousin I knew, someone always brimming with energy. Something had changed in him, and I could see it immediately. "You all right?" I asked, the tension in the air making my voice sound unsure. He nodded quickly, but his response was rushed. Yeah, everything's fine. Just need to get some sleep tonight. It's been a long few days." I didn't think much of it at the time. We both unloaded my truck and then went inside to the main house. The house was cold, colder than I expected for a place that had been lived in for so many years. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, the air inside stale and thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The kind of smell that made you feel like the place hadn't been opened in weeks, not just a few hours. Eric led me to the kitchen, where a dim light flickered above us. His movements were hurried, almost as if he was trying to avoid something. I noticed that he kept looking over his shoulder, glancing at the dark corners of the room like he expected something to appear. "You sure you're okay?" I asked again, the concern in my voice sharper now. Eric met my eyes and then quickly looked away. "Yeah, it's nothing. Just tired. Let's eat and get some sleep." As we sat down to eat, the creaking of the house seemed louder, as though the walls themselves were watching us. Every little sound in the distance, every gust of wind outside, felt wrong. And then it happened, the first thing that sent chills down my spine. From upstairs, I heard it. A soft thump, followed by the unmistakable sound of dragging footsteps. Eric froze, his fork halfway to his mouth, his face drained of color, his hands trembling as he slowly placed the fork down. He looked at me, his mouth opening to speak, but nothing came out. I stood up slowly, unsure whether I'd heard it right. "Eric? Who's upstairs?" His voice was barely a whisper. Nobody's up there." But I knew he was lying. I could feel it in the air, the tension that thickened as each second passed. The sound from above grew louder, closer. I stood in the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. The dragging sound from upstairs was undeniable. It wasn't just the creaking of an old house. It was deliberate, slow, heavy, like something or someone was moving through the upper floor. I turned to Eric, expecting him to offer some explanation. But his face was pale, his eyes wide, as if he had seen a ghost. "Eric, what the hell is going on?" I asked, my voice more forceful now. He didn't answer. He just stood there, frozen in place. The silence between us was suffocating. The footsteps upstairs grew louder, each thud echoing through the house. It felt like they were getting closer to the stairs. Without a word, I made my way toward the staircase. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but my feet moved before my brain could process the fear rising in my chest. I reached the foot of the stairs and paused. The air felt heavier here, colder. "Eric!" I called over my shoulder, but he didn't respond. The thumping continued, dragging across the floor above us. It wasn't a person walking. It sounded like something being dragged, something heavy. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My mind raced with thoughts of who or what could be up there. With a deep breath, I stepped onto the first stair. The wood groaned under my weight, and I immediately regretted it. The sound from above stopped. For a split second, there was only silence. My heart hammered in my chest, and I froze, waiting for whatever was upstairs to make its move. And then it came. A whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but it was unmistakable. A low, guttural voice, like something that had been buried for too long, murmuring just above a whisper. "Get out." I stumbled back, nearly tripping on the stairs, my pulse racing. The voice wasn't Eric's. It wasn't human, and it wasn't the wind. "Nick," Eric finally spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Don't go up there." I turned to face him. His face was twisted in fear, his hands shaking. It was like he had seen something I couldn't, but his eyes were wide, desperate, as if pleading for me to stay away. I should have listened to him. I should have turned around, walked out of that damn house, and never looked back. But I didn't. I kept climbing. As I reached the top of the stairs, the air grew colder still. The hallway before me was dark, the shadows thick and oppressive. I could barely see a thing. There was only the faint outline of the walls and the closed doors leading to the bedrooms. But one of the doors, the one at the far end, was slightly ajar. I couldn't help myself. I had to look. I took a step forward, the floor creaking beneath my feet. Then I heard it again, the dragging sound, this time coming from behind that door. I walked towards it, slowly, as if my feet were moving on their own. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to shift. Felt wrong. I felt wrong. I reached for the door handle. My hand trembled as I gripped it, my fingers cold, slick with sweat. I pushed the door open, and that's when I saw it. There, in the center of the room, was an old rocking chair. It creaked with every small movement, but no one was sitting in it. The dragging sound stopped. The room was unnervingly still. And then, as I stood there, frozen, I saw something shift in the shadows. A figure, indistinct, like a person but not quite. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes on me. I could feel it watching, waiting. I turned to leave, but as I reached for the door, it slammed shut on its own. The room went pitch black. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, the sudden force of it making me jump back. My heart nearly leapt out of my chest. The darkness in the room felt like it was pressing in on me, swallowing every ounce of light from the hallway. I stood frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my mind racing. I reached for the doorknob again, my fingers trembling violently as I tried to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the door had been locked from the inside. No, not locked. Something was holding it shut. My pulse raced, the weight of the darkness pressing in from every side. I could feel the presence behind me, cold and suffocating. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and I spun around, my eyes frantically searching the shadows. Nothing, but I wasn't alone. I could feel it. Something was there, standing just out of my sight. The temperature in the room dropped even more. My breath came out in visible puffs of mist. It wasn't just cold anymore. It was unnatural. And then I heard the whispers again. But this time they were louder, more insistent. They weren't just words, they were commands. "Leave. Now." The voice was harsh, hoarse, as if it came from deep within the earth. It rattled in my bones, making me feel sick to my stomach. I staggered backward, still unable to tear my eyes away from the darkness. I needed to get out of that room. I slammed my shoulder into the door, desperate to break it open. The sound of wood cracking echoed through the room, but the door still wouldn't move. "Nick, get out of there." I heard Eric's voice from the hallway, distant but full of panic. He was shouting, but his words seemed muffled, as if the house itself was swallowing his words. Another sharp crack of the door, and this time it opened just a fraction. I shoved it harder, the wood groaning under the pressure. It was as if the house itself didn't want me to leave. The darkness seemed to reach out for me, but with one final shove, I stumbled into the hallway and slammed the door shut behind me. I stood there, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, but the cold didn't seem to leave. The shadows in the hallway were longer, more distorted. I turned to face Eric, who was standing at the top of the stairs, his eyes wide with terror. You shouldn't have gone up there," he whispered hoarsely. "What the hell's going on, Eric?" My voice cracked as the weight of fear finally hit me. I had never seen him like this, not once in my life. He took a step back, his face pale, his lips trembling. "It's the house. It's been happening for years." I didn't know what he meant, but the look on his face was enough to tell me that whatever it was beyond anything I could understand. I wanted to scream at him, demand answers, but something in his eyes kept me from doing it. Something in his eyes told me that whatever was going on, he was afraid too. Suddenly, I heard something behind me. Another noise from upstairs. Not the dragging sound this time, but a loud bang, like something heavy had fallen. "Don't go up there," Eric pleaded, his voice cracking with fear. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't just leave, but staying here wasn't an option either. Something was wrong with this place. I could feel it in every inch of my body, in every breath I took. This house was alive in a way that nothing should be. I turned to face him. "Eric, what happened? What's up there?" His eyes darted nervously to the staircase, then to the closed door I had just come out of. He swallowed hard, his face pale as a ghost. I don't know how to explain it, but I can't stay here. You shouldn't either." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "Every time someone stays here, things get worse." "Worse?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" Eric's eyes shifted again, and he took a step backward, as if he didn't want to say it aloud. "It's not just the house," he said in a hoarse whisper. "It's what is here." Before I could ask him what he meant, the door at the end of the hallway, the one I'd just been at, suddenly creaked open again. And this time I didn't hear a whisper. No voice, just the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, coming closer. The footsteps were growing louder. There was no mistaking it now. Someone, or something, was moving toward us from the room I had just left. I felt my chest tighten with dread, my entire body frozen in place. I looked at Eric, but he was backing away slowly, his face pale and stricken with a fear I had never seen before. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He seemed paralyzed, trapped by whatever was coming down that hallway. The air around me felt thick, like it was getting harder to breathe with every step the figure took. The footsteps were unmistakable now, slow, deliberate, dragging along the floor with a heavy, unnatural sound, like something being dragged behind it. The rhythm was eerily constant, methodical. It was like whatever it was knew exactly where we were and wasn't in a hurry. I tried to step forward, to move, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. It was as if the house was holding me in place, anchoring me to the spot. "Eric," I whispered, my voice shaking. "What's happening?" He didn't answer. Instead, he gave me a look that said everything. His eyes were wide, bloodshot with terror, and his lips trembled as if he was struggling to keep himself from screaming. The footsteps were closer now. The air felt heavy, like the entire house was closing in on us, squeezing us tighter with every second that passed. Then, without warning, the sound of dragging stopped. The house fell into an unnatural silence. But it wasn't over. I heard breathing. Low, shallow, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Right behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my ears, but there was nothing. The hallway behind me was empty, shrouded in the same thick, suffocating darkness as before. I stepped back, my pulse racing, but there was no escape. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and in that instant, I realized something. The house wasn't just old. It wasn't just creaky. It wasn't just haunted. It was alive. And whatever was in it, whatever had been dragging those footsteps, wasn't going to let us leave. Eric's voice finally broke the silence, but it wasn't the voice I was used to. It was barely more than a rasp, a whisper barely hanging on. "You need to go," he said, his words so quiet they almost got lost in the air. "I'm not. I won't be able to leave." "What are you talking about?" I asked, the fear creeping into my voice. "Eric!" Snap out of it, but his eyes were distant now, like he wasn't even seeing me anymore. His body shook, his hands trembling uncontrollably as he pointed down the hallway, toward the open door at the end. I glanced toward the door, my stomach lurching with dread. It wasn't just open now. The shadows in the room seemed to move, twisting and curling in unnatural patterns, like something was waiting in the dark. And then I saw it, a figure, barely discernible in the dark. Its shape was jagged, distorted, almost like it was being stretched out of the shadows. Its form flickered in and out of focus, but I could feel its eyes on me, the oppressive weight of its gaze. It wasn't human. I could feel it deep in my bones. It wasn't a person. It was something else entirely. Without thinking, I bolted. I grabbed Eric by the arm, pulling him with me as I sprinted toward the stairs. The house groaned beneath our feet as we ran, but something was chasing us. I could hear its slow, dragging footsteps, like it was crawling after us, inch by agonizing inch. We reached the stairs, but when I turned to look behind me, I saw it. The figure was standing in the doorway, watching us. It was closer now, its features becoming clearer. Its eyes, God, those eyes, empty, black as coal, with no light in them, no sign of life. Just a void, a cold, dark void staring back at me. "Nick?" Eric's voice was barely a whisper, but I could hear the terror in it. He was shaking harder now, barely able to stand. "You need to leave. Now." I didn't know what to do. My mind was a blur of panic, and the only thing I could think of was getting out of that house. But how? The front door was still locked. The windows impossible. The shadows in the hallway seemed to be alive, like they were closing in around us. And then I heard it again. The whisper. "Leave. Leave now, or stay forever." It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence, a pressure that pressed down on me, suffocating me. And that's when I knew. Whatever was in this house didn't just want us out. It wanted us trapped. I could feel it closing in, the darkness, the whispers, the pressure building around me, making it hard to breathe. Eric was pulling away from me now, his body shaking with fear, his face twisted with terror. I could barely hear him over the deafening pulse in my ears. "Nick, leave. Now." His voice was barely a rasp, a pitiful plea, but it broke through my panic enough to focus my mind. We couldn't stay here. I had to get us out. The stairs creaked as we moved, but the dragging footsteps were still coming closer. And every step I took felt heavier, like something was pulling at my feet, trying to drag me back into the house. It wasn't just the weight of fear anymore. The house itself felt alive, pushing back against us, unwilling to let us go. We reached the bottom of the stairs, and I rushed toward the front door. The house groaned beneath us, its timbers creaking, as if it was trying to fight us off, to stop us from leaving. I grabbed the doorknob, twisted it with all my might. It wouldn't budge. I cursed under my breath, shaking the handle with frantic desperation. The door remained locked, unyielding. I could feel it. Something on the other side of that door, something waiting for us to make a mistake, to falter. I slammed my shoulder against the door, again and again, my pulse racing, but it wouldn't open. Then I heard it, the softest sound at first, a click, like something had been unlocked. The door was now open, but something was wrong. The air felt colder than ever before, and as I looked up, the doorway in front of me seemed to stretch out, warping like a tunnel. The world outside, the safety, felt farther and farther away. It was as if the house was pulling everything into itself. I turned to Eric. His eyes were wide with terror, but they were locked on something behind me, something I couldn't see. "Don't go through that door," he whispered. His voice was trembling, like it was being sucked into the air. "It's not real. Don't." But it was too late. Before I could react, the door opened wider on its own, and I was pulled toward it, as if an invisible force was dragging me through. I reached out, trying to grab onto anything, but my fingers only brushed air. The darkness beyond the door seemed to swallow me whole. I was outside, But it wasn't the outside I had known. The yard was no longer familiar. The grass had turned a sickly shade of brown, and the trees twisted in unnatural ways, their branches reaching out like claws. The farmhouse loomed behind me, much bigger now, towering over me like a monster. And there, in the distance, I saw it. A figure tall and thin standing by the barn. It wasn't Eric. It wasn't anyone I knew. And that's when I realized. I wasn't outside. I was still inside. The house had made its own world, a twisted reflection of what was real, and I was trapped within it. "Eric!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. "Eric, get out of here. This isn't real. We have to." But when I turned around, he was gone. I called for him again, but my voice echoed back at me, distorted, as if I was shouting into an empty cavern. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and the barn in the distance shifted, its silhouette bending in the air like a mirage. The sound of dragging feet started again, closer now, and I knew what it was. It was coming for me. I had no choice. I turned to run, but the ground beneath me shifted. It felt like the earth itself was changing beneath my feet. Every step I took was harder, like I was sinking into quicksand. The air grew thicker, colder, and I could barely see. My breath came out in ragged gasps, clouding in front of me. And then I heard it again. The whisper, "Stay, forever." It was coming from behind me. I didn't dare look. Couldn't. Whatever was chasing me was closer now, and the footsteps were no longer slow. They were right behind me. A scream caught in my throat as I pushed myself harder, trying to reach the edge of the yard, to escape this twisted world. But no matter how far I ran, the farmhouse always seemed to be in front of me. Couldn't get away. I stopped in my tracks. There, ahead of me, in the center of the yard, I saw something I hadn't seen before. A hole in the ground, like a grave deep and wide. And standing at the edge of it, facing me, was the same figure I had seen earlier, the one by the barn. Its face was still a blur, but I could feel its eyes on me, pulling me in. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Stay with us forever." I didn't understand what it meant, but I didn't want to find out. I turned around, ready to flee back into the house, but there was no door. There was nothing, just endless darkness, stretching out into nothingness. And the footsteps, the dragging, relentless footsteps, they were closing in. I was trapped. I could feel it in every nerve, every breath. There was no escape. The darkness stretched infinitely in all directions, and the footsteps were closing in fast, too fast. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but my body refused to move. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my chest tightening with the overwhelming sense of dread that pressed down on me like a weight. The figure at the edge of the grave, its face still blurred, its shape distorted, was moving toward me, its long, crooked limbs swaying unnaturally as it took slow, deliberate steps. It was impossible to look away. It was like my body was frozen in place, forced to watch the creature slowly approach. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The air around me seemed thick, suffocating. "Stay with us forever." The whisper came again, sharper now, as if the figure was speaking directly in my mind. I didn't want to understand it. I didn't want to know what it wanted from me, but deep down, I felt it. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't a person, it wasn't even a creature from this world. It was something older, something darker. And it wasn't just the thing that was haunting this place. It was the place. The footsteps behind me grew louder, more distinct now. Whoever or whatever was chasing me was mere seconds away. My mind raced for a solution, some way to break free. But there was nothing. I was trapped in this nightmarish reality, and the only thing that existed was the creature and the infinite darkness that surrounded it. I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to do something. I turned to run. The ground beneath me buckled, but I pushed forward, forcing myself to take one step after another. Each step felt like I was wading through thick mud, my feet dragging. But I kept moving, kept fighting. There had to be an end to this. There had to be a way out. As I ran, I glanced back. The figure was closer now, its movements jerky, like it wasn't quite sure how to walk. It was almost like it was learning how to move. Its limbs twisted at impossible angles, snapping into positions that shouldn't have been possible for any living thing. And then I heard it, the scream. Not from me, not from Eric, but from somewhere far away, somewhere deep within the house. It was a scream of pain, of agony. Like someone who had lost everything, someone who had been consumed by this place. The sound echoed through the darkness, a terrible, unending wail that sent shivers down my spine. I stumbled and fell to my knees, my mind screaming at me to get up, but my body was too weak, too exhausted. My hands scraped against the ground, feeling the dirt and cold earth beneath me. I was so close to losing it, to giving up entirely. But then I felt it. Presence. Not the figure, the thing in the grave, but something else. Something familiar. A sudden warmth in the air, like a soft breeze brushing against my skin. I looked up, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I saw something real. A doorway standing alone in the distance. The edges of it shimmered with light, as if it were a portal to something else, somewhere far from this nightmarish world. The creature screeched, a sound that rattled the air around me, but I didn't look back. Couldn't. This was my chance. The only chance I would ever get. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak, my breath shallow, but I ran toward the doorway. Every part of me screamed in protest, but I pushed forward, every step fueled by the desperate need to escape, to survive. The darkness around me seemed to tighten, pressing in, pulling at me, but I didn't stop. As I neared the doorway, I heard the footsteps once more. But this time they were different. They weren't dragging anymore. They were fast, urgent. The thing behind me was no longer creeping. It was hunting. I reached the door and grabbed the handle, my hands slick with sweat, but the door wouldn't open. Panic surged through me, and I yanked harder, my fingers numb with fear. Then, with a sickening click, the door swung open, and I fell through it. I tumbled into the light. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no sensation, just the pure, unbroken feeling of freedom. The air around me smelled fresh, clean. I opened my eyes, and I was back, or so I thought. I wasn't on the farm anymore. The world around me was strange, unfamiliar. A cold emptiness stretching in all directions. The barn, the farmhouse, the trees, everything was gone. And the footsteps, the dragging, the creature, they were still here, somewhere, watching, waiting. I stood there, frozen, in the eerie, empty void that now surrounded me. The doorway, the last shred of the world I had known, had vanished behind me as quickly as it had appeared. I wasn't on the farm anymore. I wasn't anywhere real. There was no sky, no ground, only an endless black expanse, as if I had stepped out of time itself. And I knew, deep down, that I hadn't escaped. I turned around, scanning the dark abyss behind me, but I saw nothing. The footsteps had stopped, the dragging silence replaced by an ominous calm. And yet, I could feel it, the presence. It was there, watching, waiting. The very air around me seemed to shift, twisting with a malevolent force that I couldn't explain. I wanted to scream, to shout out for help, but my voice felt too small, swallowed by the dark. Then, in the distance, I saw it again. The figure. It appeared at the edge of my vision, flickering in and out like a mirage. Its silhouette was more distinct now, tall and distorted, like it was made of the very shadows themselves. It stepped forward, dragging its feet, its limbs bending and snapping at impossible angles. And its face. Oh God, its face. It was still a blur, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and hollow, like two black voids staring directly into my soul. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in, suffocating me. I backed away slowly, heart pounding, but I couldn't move fast enough. It was getting closer, faster now, its movements jerky, like it was hunting me down. The ground beneath my feet trembled with its every step. The whispers returned, louder, angrier. Stay with us, forever. I tried to run. I turned and sprinted, my legs moving as fast as they could, but it was like I was running in place. The ground beneath me shifted with every step, like the earth itself was refusing to let me go. The footsteps, the dragging steps, were right behind me now, a constant reminder that I was being pursued. I glanced over my shoulder, and there it was, closer than ever. The figure was nearly on top of me now, its outstretched arms reaching for me, its hollow eyes glinting in the dark. And then, in a single terrifying instant, I felt it. Cold fingers brushed my arm, icy and sharp, pulling me backward into the darkness. I screamed, but the sound was lost in the void, swallowed by the very air around me. It was too late. The darkness enveloped me, and I fell, deeper and deeper, into the blackness. I fought, struggled to break free, but the force was too strong. I was pulled into it, consumed by the shadows. I closed my eyes, not out of choice, but because there was nothing else left to do. The whispers were louder now, a chorus of voices, some familiar, some not, all of them pleading, demanding. And then, a strange calm settled over me. The world, the nightmare, all of it faded away. I felt weightless, like I was floating, but just as quickly as the calm had come, it was gone. I was standing in the middle of the farmhouse again. I blinked, disoriented, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I was back. The house looked the same, but something was different. The shadows were darker, the air heavier. The whispers, though faint, lingered in the back of my mind. Eric was standing in the doorway, looking at me with eyes that were no longer filled with fear, but with something else. Something empty. "You shouldn't have stayed," he said, his voice low, almost mechanical. "Eric." My voice cracked as I took a step forward. "What happened? What is this?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, unmoving, staring at me with those hollow, vacant eyes. And then I saw it. The figure, standing just behind him, its eyes fixed on me. The creature. It had followed me back. It had always been here. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. As the figure stepped closer, its distorted limbs bending in unnatural angles. And as it reached out toward me, I understood. I understood that I would never escape this place. The farmhouse, the land, the shadows, they were all part of it. I was never meant to leave. The figure's hand brushed my shoulder, cold as ice, and everything went black.